All right, rounding out the psychological theories and perspectives is the humanistic perspective. So this is probably the most subjective and individual focused of the psychological theories. It emphasizes the individual's freedom of action and search for meaning. And so it really sits on the concept that each person is unique and has value. So obviously it aligns very well with the social work profession because that is one of the key objectives of social work. But it really looks at that each person is responsible for the choices he or she makes within the limits of their freedom. So it doesn't necessarily promote anarchy, that everybody can do whatever they want based on what they want. It does have some limitations, but it does have that subjective vibe to it that as everyone is searching for their own personal individual meaning, their choices are going to reflect where they're at and what they desire from that journey. It's very strengths-based, so it focuses that people do have the capacity to change themselves and to make radical changes around what they want. Human behavior can be understood can be understood only from the vantage point of the internal frame of reference of the person. So what does that mean? It really says you have to look at the person first. So the idea that the client or the individual is the expert in their own situation is really what number 4 is highlighting. And so the individual who you're working with or observing lives and breathes their own personal life every single day. So they are going to know exactly what is going on and maybe not understand what's going on, but they are going to be kind of that like soul lens that you look at the behavior through. And so within that internal and person-specific focus, human behavior is driven by a desire for growth, personal meaning, and competence, but also by the need to experience a bond with others. So even though it's focusing on the individual and the individual desires, it does have a very relational feel to it and acknowledges that humans are relational creatures who desire to have that bond and experience with others. Carl Rogers and Fowler, Fowler has a lot of spiritual theories that you'll talk about we'll talk about when we do the spiritual dimension, but it also gets highlighted in HIPSI 2. They are kind of the founding fathers and very key players within this perspective. So strengths and weaknesses of this. Oh no, sorry, my visual. So you can have that the person is really the sole player and the primary player in this perspective. And we internally have all these different things about us. So we have this dignity, worth, value, we have strength, we have our virtues, and that we're capable and competent. Again, really highlights that strength and solution-focused perspective that is really beneficial in the social work setting. And so these external factors are what the individual has to navigate and identify and determine. It has like some of those emotive words, empathy, warmth, genuineness, but really having that need for belonging, search for meaning, personal growth. Those are all things that the individual is trying to determine for themselves. Strengths and weaknesses of this perspective. The strengths is that it does focus on differences because it's looking at each individual as somebody different with their own desires. It really opens up for a lot of discussion around diversity and acceptance around diversity. But it is noted that this perspective looks at differences on the individual level and not necessarily differences at a larger scale. So not necessarily a bad or negative thing, but it might be more useful when taking into consideration individuals. Has a high emphasis on spirituality and people's basic needs, so it does kind of incorporate a holistic approach to a person and not just limited at the biological or the psychological, but it does look at spirituality as a really key component to how we determine things in life and kind of dictates on how individuals might interact with others and their environment. So weaknesses of this one, it does pay limited attention to institutional oppression influences sense of self because it's so focused on individuals and celebrating an individual's ability and desire to create meaning, it doesn't always pull in that huge environmental piece and how that might impact a person's worldview. It is highly abstract and difficult to measure, so this is kind of similar to the social constructionist, because you're creating meaning. It's subjective, it's not necessarily objective concepts. And so it does make it very hard to measure or necessarily, I don't want to say hold a client accountable, but if it's looking for the search of meaning and it's kind of determining one's own fate, it's kind of hard to maybe challenge somebody because maybe their desires and worldview changed at that moment. So, and then that third one, like I said, there's limited focus on the environment piece. So how can we use this in social work? It is so consistent with social work's values of human dignity and worth. That is the key tenet of the perspective, and it's a key tenet in social work. So it is a very natural fit. Social workers begin by developing an understanding of how a client views their situation, and it really does emphasize the strengths perspective. So if you've ever heard someone say, like, you need to start where your client is at, well, that's exactly what the humanist perspective does. Is it's starting exactly where the client's at and where they perceive they're at. So if a client is very resistant to treatment and that's where they want to be at the moment, that's where they're at. And that's where you meet them at, because again, this perspective looks at the client as being the expert in their situation. Even though I did give it a little bit of a jab on the previous slide that it's not as effective for the macro practice, you can utilize it at a macro level. That if you are an administrator and you're working to look at the individual employee well-being and satisfaction, you can utilize that humanistic perspective because you're focusing on employee well-being as the best route to making sure an agency is effective. If you don't have happy employees, you won't stay employed and they might not do their job. And so if you're looking at kind of how each person sees the workplace and is motivated, it can make for a very healthy place to work. And then that final statement, begin where the client is. It's how we work in social work, and it's a very humanistic approach to engaging with a client.